Episode 6, The Gospels with a Common View. One of the most useful tools for studying the New Testament is the Synopsis of the Four Gospels, edited by Kurt Aland, which sets passages from the four Gospels side by side, where their theme or content seems to be in a clear relationship. This way of arranging the Gospels is particularly useful because it allows us to compare closely subtle differences in language and content where the authors handled the same material. It also lets us see the different arrangements of material in the architecture of the individual Gospels. This is especially helpful in the case of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which have a very similar structure and often share very similar content, but within that show a lot of variation. Some of it very subtle. This marks them off from John's Gospel, which has less material in common with the others, and which structures the story, the drama, in a very different way to the other three. The similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke struck ancient Christian commentators forcefully. Augustine, for instance, assumed that Matthew had been written first, and that Mark and Luke had adapted Matthew's material. Mark by leaving a lot of the teaching out, Luke by adding in teaching from other sources. By the time of Augustine, Matthew's Gospel had a special status because it contained so much of Jesus' teaching. Matthew's Gospel includes the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, which is similar to but longer than Luke's parallel Sermon on the Plain. Added to this, there was a tradition that the Gospel had been written in Hebrew by Matthew the tax collector and apostle, and later translated into Greek. Similar traditions suggested that Mark's Gospel was written by someone who had been a sort of secretary to Peter, while Luke's Gospel was written by a companion of Paul. Perhaps because of this, Matthew's Gospel, with an apostle as author, was believed to be more first-hand than the others. But there was also its status as a rich source of fundamental teaching for the ancient Christian communities. In any case, when the mainstream Christian communities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries fixed on our four Gospels as the authentic ones, Matthew ended being placed first in the list of the officially recognized Gospels. There are some modern commentators, Catholic and non-Catholic, who go with Augustine's judgment. They suppose that Matthew came first and that Mark and Luke adapted his Gospel. However, for most modern scholars, it makes more sense to suppose that Mark's Gospel came first and that Matthew and Luke reworked it, or an early version of it, occasionally drawing on material from another, now lost, common source. That common source is known affectionately as Q, which is simply from the first letter of Quelle, the German word for source. I personally find something like this way of looking at things the most helpful. It makes sense of the fact that, while Mark's Gospel is in a rather rough, almost dialect Greek, Matthew's and Luke's, in different ways, are written in much better quality Greek. Mark's Gospel doesn't seem to know about the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but the other two do. This suggests Luke and Matthew are written later than Mark. Mark and Matthew both have the story of the healing of the demon called Legion, who goes into a herd of pigs who then plunge into the lake. Mark, however, seems to make a mistake and locates the scene at Gerasa, 30 or 40 miles away from any lake. Matthew seems to correct this, locating it at Gadara, which is much closer. What for my mind is most compelling, though, is that Mark's Gospel, on its own, has a taut and compelling dramatic structure. Matthew and Luke both build on the same structure, but import into it large amounts of teaching material and parables. This is clearly very helpful for Christian communities, reading sections of the Gospel week by week and getting a sense of how the Lord is asking them to live. But it is less good for the sense of dramatic drive in the underlying narrative of the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem that shapes Mark's Gospel. We won't have time in these podcasts to go into the myriad subtle similarities and differences between these Gospels. but it is useful to share some of the sorts of conclusion that scholars have drawn. First and foremost comes the idea that the Gospel writers are never just writing for themselves, but they are writing for specific communities facing specific challenges. It follows that by paying attention to the different ways each author reports an incident or embeds a saying, and their choices of what to include and what to leave out, we can make an intelligent guess at what some of the needs of that community might have been, and get a feel for what the author might have wanted them to hear. Notice how that means that each gospel effectively offers a different lens through which to watch the Jesus story unfold. We, the readers in our time, can be helped to understand each different version of the story by reflecting on what it might have meant to those for whom that version was likely written. Let us always remember to be careful, though. This is a delicate art, and can at times feel a bit like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It is a process of intelligent exploration, not algebraic reasoning. Scripture scholars can come up with plausible and helpful ways of looking at these texts, but at the end of the day, they have to look in the mirror and say to themselves, I don't know. We also have to remember, within the Christian tradition, it is permitted for new readers to find new reader meanings. As with the Old Testament, so with the New. The sacred text is accepted as a living text, which can speak to Christians afresh in every age. At their best, the scholarly approaches can help ordinary modern readers to new insights, which help them to read the Gospels more fruitfully for their own life journey. Let's just get a flavour of the sort of intelligent guesses that people make. We'll start with Mark. Some have suggested that Mark's rough, simple Greek might have been the sort of dialect in common use in Egypt. He could be writing for a Christian community in Egypt itself, or for one of the migrant Christian groups that had formed in Rome itself. He doesn't seem to have a very clear idea of the geography of Judea. This suggests that he had never actually been there himself. Very early in the Gospel, he sets up an antagonism between Jesus and the experts in the law over the Sabbath. He includes fierce criticism of Jewish ritual practices. All these things appear in Matthew and Luke as well, but there they are balanced by much more positive appreciations of the place of Jesus' ministry within the tradition of the law of Moses. This suggests that his Gospel reflects some of the community tensions that surface in Paul's letters, between Christians who believe they have to follow Jewish practice and non-Jewish Christians who believe it is enough to have accepted Christ crucified and to live the sort of minimalist form of Torah sketched in the Acts of the Apostles. Another contrasting feature is that the apostles, including Peter, often seem to appear in a rather bad light in Mark, whether it's quarrels over status or failure to understand what's going on and read the signs that they have been given correctly. Now, all four Gospels do report Peter's failure to acknowledge Christ after his arrest. Luke and Matthew also report quarrels among the apostles over status, and they preserve the theme that the apostles are having to learn new lessons on the road. But Luke and Matthew seem to make less of this, and in some cases seem to soften the harshness of some of Jesus' criticism of his followers. Let's look at an example. Matthew, like Mark, reports the dramatic moment where Jesus starts talking about suffering and death. Instantly, Peter tries to remonstrate with him, and Jesus tells him, "Get behind me, Satan." As we compare the two accounts, we notice that Mark is blunter. Matthew adds more of a conversation. "No way will this happen to you." In Mark, Jesus turns on Peter and speaks, reproaching him. In Matthew, he turns to Peter and says to him, "Get behind me, Satan," adding an explanation. "You're putting an obstacle in my path." The context makes a difference too. You will remember that at the centre point of Mark's Gospel, Jesus asks his disciples who they say he is, and Peter says simply, "You are the Messiah." Jesus orders them to tell no one and immediately starts talking about suffering and death, which leads to the argument with Peter. The point seems clear. Peter has only half understood what it means to be a Messiah. Contrast Matthew's version of the same incident. Here, Peter sees more. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus responds by blessing Peter, using words which give him his new name and confirm him as leader of the apostles. "Happy are you, Simon, son of John. For it was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church," and so on. The fact that Peter then fails to understand that Jesus must suffer and die cannot diminish the promise of a leadership role in the post-resurrection community that Jesus has already made. It seems that affirming Peter's status is important for Matthew in a way that it isn't for Mark. Luke seems to share a similar concern to Matthew's, not to show Peter in too bad a light, but his strategy is the other way round. He keeps the simple form of Peter's acknowledgement, as found in Mark, "You are the Christ." Again, immediately after this, Jesus starts talking about his passion and death. But at this point, Luke simply leaves out the story of Peter reproaching Jesus. So what sort of explanations are available to make sense of this? We have Mark really emphasizing that Peter has only half understood the truth, and that the disciples generally are being slow to catch on. Matthew and Luke, however, don't want to put the apostles in a bad light, and Matthew goes out of his way to affirm Peter's status. Let's look at 3 possible reasons for Mark's emphasis. Here's a first explanation. According to some traditions, Mark had Peter as a source, so the report may simply reflect Peter's humility. He refuses to gloss over the failings of the disciples during the ministry of Jesus. The important thing, after all, is not that they occasionally failed, but that in spite of their failure, they could be forgiven. Then there's a second. This is more of a scripture scholar type of argument. We know from Paul's writings, particularly his angry letter to the Galatians and the Acts of the Apostles, that there were early tensions in Christian communities between those who thought they had to follow the Jewish Torah in order to be Christians, and those who followed Paul in saying it was enough to follow Christ and to avoid joining in with pagan religious practices. In Paul's own letter to the Galatians, we get a sense of a barely resolved conflict over community practices between Peter, James, and John, who exercised a leadership role amongst the Jewish Christians, and Paul with his mission to non-Jews. Incidentally, Luke gives a diplomatic account of the resolution in his Acts of the Apostles, and Paul's letter to the Romans strives to build back bridges. But clearly, in the minds of some Christians, the 3 apostles had more authority than Paul because they had followed Jesus during the period of his ministry. Paul's counterclaim is that what makes him an apostle is his life-changing vision of the risen Christ. The other apostles may have accompanied Jesus during his time on earth, but that gives them no extra authority. The core task of an apostle is to testify to the death and resurrection of Jesus. So let's take that back to our gospel. Mark may be writing as a Pauline Gentile Christian. For him, the revelation of Jesus as Messiah is only complete with his death and resurrection. When the women find the empty tomb and hear the angel's message, the other disciples are hardly mentioned. Their revelation of the resurrection is yet to come. Is Mark perhaps making the point that, as for St. Paul, the apostles' true authority comes from the vision of the crucified and risen Christ? There is a third possibility. Our text overall provides an invitation to discipleship and a model for it. Christians are going through challenging times, tempted to abandon the faith because of persecution. The gospel affirms that the journey of discipleship is often bewildering. It includes personal joy alongside sorrow and fear. There are moments of personal success and failure in mission. Some will have to follow Christ to the bitter end, trusting that the resurrection, which they do not yet see, is real. For a privileged few, strength is given by glimpses of the new life seen in a moment of transfiguration, halfway on their journey to Jerusalem. Perhaps the way the disciples are presented in the Gospel reflects lived experiences within Mark's community. But let's now lay aside the question of why Mark presents an unflattering portrait of the disciples and ask why Matthew and Luke may have wanted to make it less so. You might remember from earlier, there are reasons for thinking that Matthew's and Luke's Gospels are written after the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, whereas Mark's seem to have been written before. Up until that moment, Judaism had taken many different forms. In the context of such competing versions of Judaism, Christianity, or at least the Jewish form of it, would not have appeared fundamentally alien, even if it did upset some religious groups. The sharp confrontations between Jesus and his adversaries in the Gospels represent family quarrels. However, after the destruction of the temple, the surviving religious leadership, in which Pharisees played a leading role, consolidated what is now known as Rabbinic Judaism, with teaching centres in Babylon as well as in the Jewish territories under Roman rule. In this new context, relations between Christian and Jewish communities became more difficult, as expectations about Torah observance and Jewish identity began to change across the wider Jewish world. There are hints in the New Testament that during these years, Jewish Christians became personae non gratae in synagogues around the Roman world. So this may explain why Matthew and Luke, in very different ways, take pains to emphasize the Jewish roots of the new faith from the very beginning of their Gospels. And perhaps it also explains why they would want to give a more positive account of Peter and the other apostles. The apostles are, after all, the first Jewish Christian teachers. It would be self-defeating to present them in a bad light.